My husband texted, "I'm not coming back. I found a woman younger and more successful than you." He transferred all our joint savings to his personal account. I replied, "Congratulations." When he checked his balance the next day, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled." People always ask me when I first knew. They expect some dramatic moment. A lipstick on a collar, a strange perfume, a hushed phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. But the truth is quieter and sadder than that. The truth is, I didn't want to know. For 41 years, Dennis and I had built something I was proud of. We weren't rich, not by any stretch. He'd worked in regional sales management for a medical equipment company, and I'd spent 32 years teaching 8th grade English in Maplewood, Ohio. We drove sensible cars. We took one vacation a year, usually somewhere we could drive to. We refinanced the house twice, raised 2 children, our son Kevin and our daughter Lori. And somewhere along the way, without either of us making a grand decision about it, we became the kind of couple people called solid. That word. I used to love it. Later, I understood it had always meant something closer to invisible. Our retirement years were supposed to be peaceful. Dennis had retired 2 years before me, at 65. I followed at 63, earlier than planned, because my knees gave me trouble, and the school board offered a buyout that made financial sense. We had $340,000 in our joint savings account. Money we had scraped together over decades, through discipline, through skipping things we wanted, through saying, "not yet," more times than I could count. We had a modest pension from my teacher's union, Dennis's Social Security, and a small investment account Kevin had helped us set up. We weren't comfortable the way wealthy people are comfortable. We were comfortable the way people are when they've been careful their whole lives, and it's finally beginning to show. That was the life I thought I had. The first signs were things I explained away because I was good at that. Dennis had always been vain in a quiet way. He kept himself trim, got his hair cut every 3 weeks. But sometime around his 66th birthday, he started going to the gym 4 mornings a week. I told myself it was the cardiologist's advice. He began wearing cologne again, something he hadn't done in years. I told myself he'd found an old bottle. He started taking his phone into the bathroom, leaving it face down on the kitchen counter, angling the screen away when I walked past. I told myself he was probably just watching sports highlights and didn't want me to see how much time he wasted on it. I told myself a great many things. He started going into Columbus for what he called networking lunches with former colleagues, 2, sometimes 3 times a week. This was a man who, in retirement, had complained that he couldn't stand most of the people he'd worked with. I mentioned that once, gently. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, not angry, not guilty, just dismissive, and said, "People change, Peggy." As if I were the one being unreasonable. There was a weekend in March when he said he was visiting his old friend Ray Bucher in Cincinnati. I had no reason to disbelieve him. Ray was real. They'd known each other for 30 years. But when I called Ray's wife, Ellen, 2 weeks later, to ask about a casserole dish I thought I'd left at their house at Christmas, she told me they'd been in Florida in March. The whole month. Their granddaughter's spring recital. I sat with that information for 3 days before I said anything. When I finally asked Dennis, his answer came too fast, too smooth. He said he'd gotten the dates confused, that he'd meant a different trip, that I was being paranoid. He said it with such calm confidence that for a moment, just a moment, I almost believed him. That was the thing about Dennis. He had always been the kind of man who could say something untrue with perfect certainty, and make you feel the problem was your ability to understand. I started paying closer attention after that, not dramatically. I didn't go through his phone or hire anyone. I just watched, and I noticed that money was moving. Small amounts at first, 200 here, 300 there, withdrawn from our joint account in cash. Then larger transfers I didn't recognize, to an account number I'd never seen on our statements. I said nothing. I kept watering my tomatoes. I kept making dinner. I kept watching. Then came the morning of April 14th. I remember the date because it was the anniversary of my mother's death, and I always feel her absence more sharply on that day. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee when my phone lit up with a text from Dennis. He was not home. He had left the night before, saying he had an early meeting. The text read, "I'm not coming back. I've found a woman who is younger and more successful than you. I've had the attorney draw up separation papers. Don't try to call me." I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the table, the same way he used to set his. I looked out the window at the yard we had landscaped together 20 years ago, the oak tree we'd planted when Kevin was born, and I said out loud to no one, "Congratulations." The next morning, I checked our joint account balance. It was $12. $12. I stared at that number on the screen of my phone for a long time. Long enough that my coffee went cold. Long enough that the birds outside started their late morning quiet. That particular stillness that falls over a yard when the dew has burned off and the day has committed to being itself. $340,000 gone. I knew, even in those first stunned minutes, that I needed to be careful about what I felt. Grief was a luxury I couldn't afford yet. Panic would make me stupid. So I sat there, and I breathed slowly, the way I used to tell my 8th graders to breathe before a test they were afraid of, and I made myself think. The $340,000 was the core of it, but it wasn't everything. Once I forced myself to take full inventory, a thing I hadn't done in years because I'd trusted Dennis to manage the numbers, I found other damage. The joint credit card had a balance of $22,000 I hadn't known about. The investment account Kevin had helped us set up had been liquidated 6 weeks earlier. I only discovered this when I called the brokerage directly, and a polite young man read me the transaction history. There was also a home equity line of credit that Dennis had opened without my knowledge 18 months ago, drawing $45,000 against our house. The house that was in both our names. By the time I had written all of it down in my yellow legal pad, the total damage was somewhere north of $400,000 when you counted the debt he'd left attached to assets I still held. I am not a dramatic woman. I did not cry. Not then. I think I was too frightened to cry. The fear was specific and physical. A cold tightness in my chest. A faint ringing at the edges of my hearing. I was 64 years old. My pension was $1,850 a month before taxes. My Social Security wouldn't begin until I turned 66 at the earliest. I owned half a house with a line of credit against it, and a husband who had just informed me by text message that he was done. What would I do if I lost the house? The question sat in the room with me like a third person. I thought about calling Kevin first, but I stopped myself. Kevin is a good son. Steady. Practical. But he has a temper when it comes to his father, and I needed to think before I put other people's emotions into the room. I thought about calling Lori, but Lori had just had her second baby and was barely sleeping, and I refused to drop this on her. I thought about calling my sister Ruth in Pennsylvania, who had been divorced herself and would understand. I almost dialed her number 3 times. Instead, I made myself another cup of coffee. I sat back down at the kitchen table, and I opened my legal pad to a fresh page. I wrote at the top, what do I actually have? I had the house, half of it, legally. I had my pension. I had my car, paid off 2 years ago. I had my health, more or less. And I had something else. Something Dennis had always underestimated in me. I had 32 years of teaching children to think logically through problems they believed were impossible. What do I know for certain? I wrote. Joint marital assets cannot be unilaterally transferred without consent in Ohio. This is not a gray area. This is the law. I had been a teacher, not a lawyer. But I had spent enough years helping students navigate school bureaucracy, dealing with administrators, writing formal complaints that actually got results, to know that institutions respond to people who know the rules and cite them correctly. And I knew one more thing. Dennis had done this quickly, arrogantly, without I suspected, telling his attorney the full picture of what he'd moved and when. That was his first mistake. I picked up my phone and did not call Dennis. I did not respond to his text. Instead, I searched for family law attorneys in Columbus with strong reviews specifically for asset recovery in divorce cases. I wrote down 4 names. Then I called my bank. Not to panic at them, but to formally notify them in writing, via their fraud line, that I believed marital assets had been fraudulently transferred without my consent, and that I was requesting a full transaction history for the past 24 months. The woman on the phone sounded surprised that I was so composed. I wasn't composed. I was terrified. But I had decided something. There at my kitchen table, with the oak tree outside the window and my cold coffee and my legal pad, Dennis had taken 41 years of my life's work and treated it like a withdrawal from an ATM that belonged only to him. I was going to take it back. Not out of rage, though the rage was there, underneath everything, banked like coals. I was going to take it back because it was mine, because the law said it was mine, and because I had spent 64 years being the reasonable one in every room I'd ever been in, and I had finally, completely, run out of patience for it. His attorney had drawn up separation papers. I was going to need a better attorney. The attorney's name was Patricia Osei, and she came recommended by 2 separate reviews that mentioned the phrase, "She doesn't blink." I liked that. I needed someone who didn't blink. Her office was in a building in downtown Columbus on the 14th floor, with a view of the Scioto River that I barely noticed because I was too focused on laying out my legal pad on her desk and walking her through everything I'd written. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. She asked 3 pointed questions at the end. Then she sat back and said, "Mrs. Holloway, what your husband did, transferring jointly held marital assets without your knowledge or consent, is not just a divorce issue. Depending on how it was structured, it may constitute marital waste or dissipation, and potentially fraudulent transfer under Ohio law." "Potentially," I said. "We need documentation," she said, "which is why what you did, contacting the bank immediately, getting it on record, was exactly right." She was direct, and she was thorough. By the end of that first 2-hour meeting, we had filed for divorce on grounds of financial misconduct, placed a formal legal hold request on all known jointly held accounts, and she had sent a preservation letter to Dennis's attorney, a man named Gary Schiff, whose name Dennis had texted me along with instructions to cooperate and make this easy. Patricia explained that the preservation letter required Schiff to advise his client to preserve all financial records immediately or face sanctions. It also signaled clearly that I was not going to cooperate and make this easy. On the drive home, my phone rang. It was Dennis. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 12 seconds long. His voice had that particular quality it got when he was angry, but trying to sound reasonable. "Peggy, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding with the bank. Give me a call so we can sort this out like adults." A pause. There's no need to involve attorneys at this level. I listened to it twice in the driveway. Then I forwarded it to Patricia. That was the first moment I understood that he was scared. Not of me. Not yet. Dennis had never been afraid of me. And that was precisely the dynamic that had made 41 years possible. He was scared of the process. He had assumed I would be overwhelmed by it. I had been a public school teacher. I had been buried in paperwork, bureaucratic processes, and institutional systems my entire professional life. I was not overwhelmed by process. Process was where I lived. The documentation came in stages over the following 10 days. The bank sent me 24 months of transaction history, 47 pages. I sat at the kitchen table every evening after dinner and went through them with a yellow highlighter, the same way I used to grade papers, methodically, without skipping anything. What I found was worse than I'd initially understood. The withdrawals had begun not 6 months ago, as I'd assumed, but 19 months ago. Small amounts first, then larger. The $340,000 transfer had been the final and largest move, executed 3 days before he sent me that text. But the transaction history also showed something else. A recurring monthly transfer to an account at a different bank, $3,500 every month for 14 months. That was $49,000 I hadn't known about. Going somewhere I hadn't known about for over a year. I hired a forensic accountant. Patricia recommended her, a woman named Diane Chu. And within a week, Diane had traced that account. It belonged to a woman named Crystal Wayne, age 38, a financial advisor with an office in Columbus. A financial advisor. I sat with that detail for a long time. Dennis had met her through work, presumably. She had helped him structure this, or at minimum, she had known exactly what she was receiving and where it came from. $49,000 transferred in regular monthly installments over 14 months is not an accident. It is not a gift between friends. It is a financial arrangement, deliberate and sustained. And she was a licensed financial advisor, which meant she was subject to professional oversight. I wrote Crystal Wayne's name at the top of a fresh page in my legal pad. Underneath it, I wrote the name of the Ohio Division of Securities. Dennis had chosen a woman who was younger and more successful than me. What he hadn't accounted for was that success leaves a paper trail, and professional licenses can be reviewed. That was his second mistake. The complaint to the Ohio Division of Securities took me 3 evenings to write, and I wrote it the way I used to write the most important letters of my teaching career. Carefully, with evidence cited in footnotes, with dates, amounts, and account numbers attached as exhibits. I was not filing it out of spite, though I will not pretend spite was entirely absent. I was filing it because Crystal Wayne, as a licensed financial advisor, had an ethical and legal obligation not to receive funds she had reason to know were misappropriated marital assets. Whether she had helped Dennis plan this or simply benefited from it, her professional conduct was reviewable. Patricia also moved to freeze Dennis's newly opened personal accounts pending the divorce proceedings, citing dissipation of marital assets. The judge granted a temporary restraining order within 72 hours. The $340,000 was, for the moment, legally frozen. I want to be precise about what that moment felt like, because I think people expect triumph, and it wasn't quite that. It was more like the specific relief of seeing a structure you've built hold weight for the first time. Not joy, stability. I learned that Dennis had found out about the asset freeze on a Tuesday afternoon, when Patricia called to tell me that Gary Schiff had filed an emergency motion to dissolve it, and that the motion was riddled with procedural errors, which told her Schiff had written it in a hurry, under pressure from an agitated client. Dennis called me 4 times that evening. I didn't answer. He showed up at the house the following morning at 7:45 before I'd finished my coffee. I heard his car in the driveway. I still recognized the sound of his engine after all these years, and I stood at the kitchen window and watched him walk to the front door. He looked thinner than I remembered, which was strange because it had only been 3 weeks. Or maybe I was finally seeing him clearly. I opened the door before he knocked. "We need to talk," he said. "You can talk to Patricia Osei," I said, and I gave him her card. He'd already had it from the preservation letter, but I felt it was important to hand it to him again, directly, so he understood I wasn't confused about where the conversation now lived. His face changed then. That was when I saw, for the first time, something I had never seen from Dennis in 41 years. Not anger. I'd seen anger. Something closer to contempt, unguarded and ugly. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said. "Crystal has resources you don't. She has contacts. You're going to spend the next 2 years of your life fighting something you can't win, and you're going to end up with less than what I was willing to give you." I said, "Thank you for stopping by, Dennis." And I closed the door. My hands were shaking, but I didn't let him see that. I stood in the hallway for a moment with my back to the door, listening to him stand on the porch. Then I heard his footsteps go back down the path, and his car door close, and the engine turn over. Crystal Wayne came 2 days later. She didn't come to the house. I suspect even she understood that would be too far. But she called from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, her voice was professionally warm in a way that reminded me of a salesperson who has been trained to sound like a friend. She said she thought it would be good for the two of us to clear the air. She said that she and Dennis wanted to be fair to me, that there was an offer on the table that my attorney apparently hadn't communicated clearly, and that if I would agree to settle quickly, she could personally ensure that certain matters remained private. Which matters? I asked. A pause. The full scope of Dennis's financial restructuring over the past 2 years, she said carefully. Some of it is complex. It doesn't need to become public. I understood then that she was frightened of the securities complaint. She was telling me, obliquely, that if I dropped my legal actions, she would use her influence to make Dennis settle generously. And she was implying, just barely, that if I didn't, things might become difficult for me in ways she wasn't specifying. I appreciate the call, I said. Please have your attorney contact mine. I hung up. Then I sat down in my kitchen chair, and for the first time since this had all begun, I let myself be frightened. Truly frightened. For about 90 seconds. She was 38 and connected, and she had something to lose. That combination made people unpredictable. Then I called Patricia and reported the call in full. That call, Patricia said after a brief silence, may have just become our best piece of evidence. She explained that an extortionate inducement to settle, offering private suppression of information in exchange for dropping legal claims, was ethically problematic at minimum and potentially relevant to the securities complaint. Had I recorded it? I had not, but my phone records would show the call, and my contemporaneous notes, dated and time-stamped, would be entered into the record. That weekend, I drove to Lori's house in Dayton. I hadn't told her everything yet. I'd been protecting her. But I told her now. She cried, which I expected. Then she got very quiet, which I knew from her childhood meant she was thinking. She looked at me across her kitchen table, her baby asleep in the next room, and she said, "Mom, you're doing the right thing. Don't stop." I stayed 2 nights. I played with my granddaughter. I slept 8 hours each night, which I hadn't done in weeks. When I drove back to Maplewood on Monday morning, I felt, if not rested, then at least re-anchored. The oak tree was in the yard where I'd left it. I went inside and opened my legal pad. The settlement offer arrived formally, through Schiff's office, on a Wednesday morning. Patricia called me before I'd seen it, to prepare me, which I appreciated. She said it was, in her professional assessment, an offer designed to look reasonable to someone who doesn't know what they're actually entitled to. Dennis was proposing to return $180,000 of the $340,000 transferred, roughly half, plus allow me to retain the house, provided I assumed the full balance of the $45,000 home equity line. He was offering no acknowledgement of the $49,000 transferred to Crystal's account, characterizing those as personal expenses incurred prior to separation. His attorney was framing this as generous. Patricia laid out the math for me plainly. If I accepted, I would receive $180,000, own a house with $45,000 in debt against it, and walk away from any claim on the $49,000 transferred to Crystal, the remaining $160,000 of savings, or any portion of Dennis's pension, which, as a long-term spouse in Ohio, I had a legitimate claim against. The total I would be surrendering was, by her conservative estimate, somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000. "What's your read?" I asked her. "My read," she said, "is that they're scared of the securities complaint and they want this resolved before the discovery process forces full financial disclosure." "Then we decline," I said. Agreed. I didn't feel triumphant declining it. I felt the particular calm of having made a decision that aligned with what I actually knew to be true, rather than with what fear was suggesting. There is a difference, and it took me 64 years to understand it consistently. What I did feel declining that offer was clear. Patricia sent the formal rejection that afternoon. By Friday, Dennis had apparently told Kevin, because Kevin called me, uncomfortable and trying not to show it. He was careful. He didn't pressure me, to his credit. But I could hear in his voice the worry that this would drag on for years and cost more in legal fees than I'd recover. I told him I understood the concern, and that Patricia and I had done the math, and that the math supported continuing. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Okay, Mom, I trust you." That meant more to me than I knew how to say, but it was Ruth, my sister Ruth, calling from Pennsylvania on a Sunday afternoon, who gave me something different. Ruth had been divorced at 51, after a marriage that had also ended in financial deception, and she had settled too quickly out of exhaustion and fear. She had told me this once, years ago, briefly, and I hadn't fully understood it then. I understood it now. "Don't do what I did," she said. "Don't let them grind you down until settling feels like relief. That's the strategy. Exhaustion. They want you to be so tired that less sounds like enough." We talked for 2 hours that Sunday, longer than we'd talked in years. I told her about Crystal's call, about the offer, about Patricia. She told me about a women's support group she'd found after her divorce. Not therapy exactly, but a weekly meeting of women in similar circumstances, many of them older, most of them surprised to find themselves there. She said it had been the thing that kept her sane. I wasn't sure a support group was for me. I am a private person and always have been. But the following Tuesday, I drove to a meeting at a community center in Columbus that Patricia had mentioned in passing, a divorce support group specifically for women over 55. I sat in a circle of 11 women in folding chairs drinking bad coffee from a machine in the corner, and I didn't say much. But I listened. What I heard was a version of my own story, repeated in different keys. Women who had trusted, who had been managed and then discarded, who had been told they were overreacting, who had been offered insufficient settlements designed to look fair to people without attorneys. And women who had fought, some successfully, some not. And what the difference between them seemed to be. The difference was not money. It was not age. It was not even legal representation, though that mattered. The difference was whether they had decided, at the foundational level, that what had been done to them was genuinely wrong, and that being right entitled them to persist. I drove home that evening, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Less alone, not warm, not hopeful in a simple way. The situation was still what it was, but grounded in the understanding that the experience was not a personal failure unique to me. It was a pattern, and patterns can be understood, and things that can be understood can be countered. Dennis and Crystal were watching, I was certain of that. Patricia had told me that Schiff had been unusually quiet since the offer was rejected. No motions, no new filings. And that in her experience, silence from the opposing side usually meant they were reassessing. Let them reassess. Let them wonder what I was doing. I went home. I watered my tomatoes. I wrote 3 pages of notes for Patricia's next briefing. I waited. They came on a Saturday. That detail still bothers me somehow. That they chose a Saturday when they knew I'd be home, when there would be no professional buffer, no business hours to hide behind. It had the quality of a decision made by someone who understood that the weekend made a person more vulnerable, more domestic, more likely to be caught simply being human. I had spent the morning doing ordinary things, watering the kitchen herbs, paying an electric bill, rinsing the breakfast dishes. And I think that was part of what made it jarring. The intrusion arrived into an ordinary morning as though it had every right to be there. Dennis arrived first, alone, at 11 in the morning. He was dressed carefully, not formally, but in the deliberate way of someone who has thought about appearing unthreatening. He had brought coffee, 2 cups from a place we used to go together on Saturday mornings, back when Saturday mornings were a thing we shared. The gesture was calculated. I understood that even as I registered the old familiarity of the cups, the particular logo on the sleeve. And I made myself register both things simultaneously, without letting the familiarity win. I opened the door because I had decided beforehand that I would. Refusing to open the door would have given him a grievance. Opening it gave me information. I did not take the coffee. He sat at the kitchen table, his old chair, which I noticed, and he began by saying he'd been thinking, that he'd been unfair, that he understood I was upset, that he hoped we could find a way through this that didn't hurt the children or drag everything into court. The word upset is the one I fixed on. After 41 years and $400,000, he had chosen the word upset, as though I'd overreacted to a broken dish, as though the appropriate response to what he had done was a conversation over coffee on a Saturday morning that ended with mutual understanding and a handshake. I had taught adolescence for 32 years, and I knew minimizing language when I heard it. I had spent 3 decades teaching children to identify it in the texts they read. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him one question. Are you here to offer a different settlement, or are you here to ask me to stop the proceedings? He looked at me for a moment. I'm here because I think this has gotten out of hand, he said, which answered my question precisely. You should speak with Patricia, I said. He changed tactic. He told me the securities complaint was going to embarrass the whole family. Kevin's name would come up because Kevin had helped set up the investment account, and didn't I care about that? This was the sharpest thing he said, because Kevin is the person I would do almost anything to protect. I felt it land. I think Dennis saw it land. He kept talking, and the implications thickened. That Crystal had colleagues in Columbus's financial community, that Patricia Osi was known for running up billable hours on cases she couldn't win, that a 64-year-old woman on a teacher's pension couldn't sustain a 2-year legal fight, no matter how righteous she felt. He had not, in 41 years, ever spoken to me about money this way. He had always managed the finances, and I had always trusted him to, and he had used that trust as the operating assumption under which everything else had been arranged. Now, sitting in my kitchen in his careful clothes with his calculated coffee, he was using that same financial authority, the authority I had granted him out of trust, as a weapon to make me feel incompetent. I sat with that recognition, quietly, while he talked. Then Crystal walked in. She had been waiting in his car. The staging of it, him softening me up, then her arrival, was transparent once I saw it. But in the moment, it was startling. She was tall and composed, dressed in the specific way of professional women who have decided that Polish is power. She sat down at my kitchen table as though she had a right to be there, and she looked at me with an expression of careful sympathy that I recognized from 32 years of teaching. The expression of someone who has decided you are not very intelligent and is being patient about it. Margaret, she said. No one calls me Margaret. I know this situation is painful, but I want you to understand that Dennis and I are committed to being fair. The offer we made was genuine. What you're doing now, the securities filing, the asset freeze, it's going to damage everyone, including you. Courts in Ohio take a long time. Your legal fees are already, $15,000? 20? And for what? She let the question sit in the air. I could see she had rehearsed this. Not the words exactly, but the posture of it. The practiced reasonableness of someone who delivers difficult assessments professionally and has learned to frame them as concern. She was watching me the way you watch a person you believe is about to make a predictable mistake, waiting with patient certainty for the moment they recognize you were right. I looked at her. She was younger than my daughter. For what? I repeated. for $400,000 in marital assets that my husband transferred without my knowledge or consent. That's what. Her expression shifted. The careful sympathy fell away, and what replaced it was something colder and more honest. She did not think I should exist in this conversation. I was an obstacle, not a person. She glanced at Dennis once, a quick, functional look that contained an entire silent argument, and then looked back at me with the settled expression of someone who has decided to stop being careful. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "You're sitting in my kitchen," I said, "telling me I'm making a mistake. Please leave." Dennis stood up. His face was flushed. I knew that flush. That was the flush he got when something wasn't going the way he'd planned, and he was deciding whether to escalate. He pushed back his chair harder than was necessary, and the sound of it on the kitchen tile was loud in the quiet house. For a moment, I genuinely didn't know what he would do. Then Crystal put a hand briefly on his arm, and something passed between them, and he chose the door instead. On his way out, he said, without turning around, "You'll regret this, Peggy." I didn't answer. I locked the door. I stood in the kitchen for a while without sitting down. My heart was going too fast, and my hands were, again, not entirely steady. The oak tree outside the window was very still. What they had attempted, the two of them, orchestrated, scripted in whatever conversation they'd had in the car before he knocked, had been designed to make me feel small and isolated and financially overwhelmed. And the truthful thing I can tell you is that it had partially worked, in the sense that the fear was real. Knowing they were coordinated. Knowing Crystal had resources and connections and a professionals facility with financial language. Knowing Dennis still understood, after 41 years, precisely which pressure points on me to use. But the fear did something I hadn't expected. It clarified things. Every time the fear spiked, it was immediately followed by a kind of bright, clean anger. Not hot anger, but cold. The anger of someone who has finally and irrevocably understood what was being done to her, and who has decided that understanding is enough. You can be frightened and decided at the same time. I know that now. I sat down. I opened my legal pad. I wrote down every word of the conversation I could remember, dated and timed, with a note about Crystal's arrival and the staging of it. Then I called Patricia. The deposition took place in Patricia's conference room on the 3rd floor of her building, on a Tuesday in late October. The Scioto River was gray outside the windows, and the trees along it had gone bare. I had been in that room several times by then, and I knew the chairs and the long table and the particular sound of the ventilation system, and all of that familiarity helped. I had slept well the night before, which surprised me. I'd expected insomnia, expected to lie awake running through scenarios. Instead, I'd slept 7 hours and woken early and eaten a proper breakfast and driven to Columbus in the clear, cold morning, feeling something very close to ready. Dennis came in with Gary Schiff and a paralegal whose name I never learned. Crystal was not present for Dennis's deposition. They were handled separately. But I knew she was in the building, on a different floor, being deposed by the young associate Patricia had brought in specifically for that purpose. Dennis was wearing a suit I'd bought him 4 years ago for Kevin's firm's annual dinner. I noticed that, with a specific and complicated feeling, I chose not to examine at length. And then I put it away. Discovery had, by this point, produced documentation that Gary Schiff had clearly not anticipated we would obtain. Diane Chu's forensic accounting had traced not just the $49,000 to Crystal's account, but an additional $31,000 that had been transferred to a limited liability company Dennis had formed 11 months ago, a company called Holloway Advisors, LLC, which had, as far as Diane could determine, conducted no actual business. The LLC had been formed with Crystal as the registered agent. That was the piece Dennis hadn't planned for us to find. That single detail transformed the financial picture from a husband hastily moving assets during a deteriorating marriage into something that looked considerably more like a structured and premeditated transfer of marital assets to an entity jointly controlled with his girlfriend. Months before he sent me that text, months before he claimed the marriage had broken down, months before he claimed he had simply fallen in love with someone else. It reframed everything that had come before it. The gym visits at 6 in the morning, the cologne, the networking lunches, the weekend in Cincinnati that wasn't. All of it organized not around impulse, but around a plan, patient and sustained, while I watered my garden and made dinner and said nothing because I had trusted him. Patricia had the documentation organized into binders, color-coded, tabbed, dated. She had sent copies to Schiff 3 weeks earlier, per the rules of discovery. He'd had time to prepare. But in the room, watching Dennis look at those binders, I understood that preparation and readiness are different things. His eyes moved across the tabs. Once, quickly, then settled somewhere in the middle distance, and I watched him understand what the morning was going to contain. Patricia began calmly, working through the timeline. The first LLC filing, the first transfer, the month-by-month deposits into Crystal's account. Dennis answered carefully at first, in short sentences, the way Schiff had presumably coached him. But Patricia was methodical, and she did not allow ellipsis. When he said he couldn't recall, she produced a document. When he characterized a transfer as a loan, she produced the LLC's registration, showing no loan agreement had ever been filed. When he suggested that Crystal had acted independently in managing certain accounts, Patricia produced the email. There was an email. Diane had found it through the bank records, a forwarded account statement sent from Dennis's personal email to Crystal's professional address, with a single line from Dennis above the forwarded content. Running ahead of schedule. She has no idea. It was dated 14 months before he sent me that text. When Patricia read the email aloud in the deposition, the room changed. Not dramatically. No one raised their voice. No one stood up. But the quality of the silence shifted. Dennis stopped answering questions and looked at Schiff. Schiff's expression was controlled in the particular way of attorneys who have just encountered something their client did not disclose to them. He asked for a 5-minute break. Patricia granted it without comment. In the break, I sat at the conference table and looked out at the gray river, and I thought about the morning of April 14th, sitting at my own kitchen table with my cold coffee and the oak tree, and that text message, and the specific quality of the silence in the house after I read it. The house had been so quiet. I hadn't understood that morning how large the silence actually was. All the space that had been emptied out over 19 months of careful, deliberate preparation, she has no idea. He had been right at the time, and then he had been wrong. When they came back in, Dennis was different. The careful composure he'd maintained for the first 40 minutes of the deposition was gone, replaced by something I recognized from decades of watching people who are used to managing situations discover that a situation has moved beyond their management. He was trying to reframe in real time, which meant he was talking too much and listening too little. He began explaining the LLC as a legitimate retirement planning vehicle. Common practice, nothing unusual. Any financial advisor would tell you the same. He began characterizing the transfers to Crystal's account as professional consulting fees, because she was a licensed financial advisor, because he'd retained her in a professional capacity for retirement planning, because he was entitled to seek financial guidance from whomever he chose. He said this with increasing conviction, as though conviction could retroactively make it true. I had watched students do exactly this on essay exams, write with great confidence about things they didn't quite understand, hoping the confidence itself would carry the grade. It never did. Patricia asked him to identify the written contract he had signed retaining Crystal as a professional financial consultant. He said the arrangement had been informal. She asked him to identify any invoice Crystal had issued for professional services rendered over the 14-month period in question. He said the invoices might be in storage somewhere. He'd have to look. She asked him to confirm whether Crystal had disclosed, as required under Ohio Financial Advisor regulations, that she was simultaneously in a personal romantic relationship with a client whose marital assets she was helping to manage. He said he didn't know what Crystal had or hadn't filed with the relevant regulatory bodies. That was her professional responsibility, not his. Patricia looked at him steadily for a moment. The room was very quiet. Outside, a truck moved along the street below, and the sound of it rose briefly and faded. Then she said, in exactly the same tone she'd used for every other question, "Mr. Holloway, the Ohio Division of Securities opened a formal review of Ms. Wayne's professional license approximately 6 weeks ago. In the course of that review, Ms. Wayne's client disclosure records have been examined in detail. She did not disclose the personal relationship. She also did not file the required documentation for the transactions we've been discussing today." She paused for one beat. "Your characterization of these transfers as professional consulting fees would, if accepted by this proceeding, constitute evidence that Ms. Wayne engaged in a series of undisclosed conflicted transactions with a client. I want to make sure you understand that, and that you'd like to continue with that characterization." The room was very quiet. Schiff leaned over and spoke in a low voice close to Dennis's ear. Whatever he said took about 15 seconds. Dennis said, "I'd like to take a recess." Patricia said, "Of course." She looked across the table at me, and the look was precise and brief, and said everything it needed to say. "We have it." Not triumphant. Patricia was not a triumphant person, which was one of the things I admired most about her. Just accurate. The look of someone who has done the work correctly and is now watching the work hold. I nodded once and looked back out at the river. The settlement negotiations that followed the deposition took 6 weeks, which felt long and, in retrospect, was fast. Gary Schiff filed no further motions after that Tuesday. The emergency motion to dissolve the asset freeze was quietly withdrawn. Dennis's new characterization that the transfers to Crystal's account were personal gifts, not consulting fees, which rather undermined his earlier position, created a set of problems for Crystal's securities review that her own attorney was apparently struggling to manage. Patricia told me she believed they had calculated correctly that going to trial would be worse than settling. The email, she has no idea, was not going away. The LLC records were not going away. A trial would produce a public record. The final settlement, signed in the first week of December, gave me the following. The house, free of the home equity line, which Dennis was required to retire in full from his share of the settlement. The entirety of the original $340,000 from the joint savings account, returned. An additional $49,000, representing the total transferred to Crystal's account, which the settlement characterized as dissipation of marital assets. A share of Dennis's pension, not the full amount I might have argued for at trial, but 32%, the portion corresponding to years of the marriage during which my income had contributed to household stability. And legal fees. Dennis's attorney was required. Under a sanctions motion, Patricia had filed for the procedurally defective emergency motion to pay a portion of mine. The total recovery was $412,000, plus the ongoing pension share. I signed the papers in Patricia's office on a Friday afternoon. Her paralegal had brought in a small box of cookies from the bakery downstairs, which I thought was a kind gesture. I ate one cookie and drank coffee and signed my name on 11 documents, and when I was done, Patricia shook my hand and said, "You were a good client, Mrs. Holloway. You were patient and you paid attention." "I was a teacher," I said. "It's the same skill set. The house was mine. The debt against it was gone. The oak tree was still in the yard." Crystal Wayne's securities review concluded 3 months later with a formal censure. Not license revocation, but a public disciplinary record and a fine, and a requirement that she complete additional ethics training. Censure is not nothing. In a field that runs on reputation and referrals, a public disciplinary record creates a particular kind of difficulty. Several clients she had been cultivating, according to a mutual acquaintance of Patricia's, quietly moved their accounts elsewhere after the review became public record. Dennis did not attend the final proceedings. He communicated entirely through Schiff, which I think was easier for both of us. The marriage of 41 years was dissolved without us being in the same room at the end, which may have been appropriate. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said through attorneys and depositions and a forensic accountant's color-coded binders. Kevin drove down from Cleveland the weekend after the settlement was signed. He took me to dinner at a place I'd always liked, and we talked for 3 hours, not mainly about the divorce, about his kids, about Lori's new baby, about the garden I was planning to redo in the spring. At one point, he put his hand over mine on the table and said, "I'm sorry you had to do all of that, Mom." And I told him that I wasn't, which surprised him, and which I meant. I wasn't sorry, not for the fight, for the marriage, perhaps, or for the version of it I had believed in, but not for learning, at 64, that I could protect what was mine, that I could navigate a complex legal process while frightened, that I could maintain clarity under pressure. Those were not small things to learn. I drove home that night on the highway with the radio off through the particular dark of an Ohio December, and I felt something I didn't immediately have a word for. Not happiness exactly. Solidity, maybe. That old word, the one I used to love, only this time it was mine alone. The spring after the settlement, I had the back garden completely redone. I'd been thinking about it for years and had always deferred. Too expensive, not the right time. Dennis didn't see the point of spending money on what he called dirt and flowers. I hired a young landscaper named Marco, who had good ideas and charged fairly, and we spent 3 weeks in April turning the back half of my yard into something I'm still proud of. A raised kitchen garden with 8 beds, a proper stone path, and a climbing rose along the back fence that I'd wanted since I first saw one like it at a garden show in Columbus 15 years ago. I also began teaching again, in a different way. The public library in Maplewood had a literacy program for adult learners, people working toward their GED, people learning English, older adults who had gaps they wanted to fill. I started volunteering one afternoon a week in January, and by March, they'd asked me to take on a second session. It turned out I hadn't retired from teaching because I was done with it. I'd retired because my knees hurt and the administration had become difficult. The thing itself, sitting across from someone with a pencil and a text, I still loved that. Ruth came to visit in June. We spent 5 days together, which we hadn't done since our mother died. We cooked and walked and talked in the evenings in the back garden with glasses of wine and the climbing rose filling in on the fence behind us. She looked better than she had in years, and she said the same about me. I believed her because I felt it. Lori brought the baby in July, and Kevin brought his family at Thanksgiving. The house was full of children and noise, and I found I was genuinely happy in a way that was uncomplicated, which is rarer than people think. Dennis and Crystal's story reached me in pieces, the way neighborhood information does. Through Kevin's passing mentions, through a former colleague of Dennis's I ran into at the grocery store who clearly didn't know what to say and said too much. Crystal's income had taken a meaningful hit after the securities censure. Several clients had moved their accounts, and the disciplinary record made certain institutional referrals difficult. Dennis's settlement obligations had left him with considerably less than he'd planned for, and the Columbus apartment was not cheap. I didn't track any of this actively, and I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected. What I felt was closer to neutral, the particular neutrality of someone who has gotten what they were owed and no longer needs anything further from the situation. Two people who had found each other through the dismantling of a 41-year marriage, who had planned and deceived together, did not find it straightforward to simply become a peaceful domestic unit once the plan had partially unraveled. But that was their life, not mine. My life was the raised beds, and the climbing rows, and the Tuesday afternoons at the library, and the long phone calls with Ruth and the granddaughter who had an opinion about everything. My life was the oak tree, and the house that was mine without encumbrance. I was 65 years old and I lived alone and I was not lonely. That surprised me more than anything else. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's a simple one. Knowing your rights is not the same as using them. I was afraid. I was 64 and alone, and the numbers were terrifying. But I wrote things down. I found the right help. And I did not settle for less than what the law said was mine. Dennis thought I had no idea. He was wrong about that in the end. What would you have done, sitting at that kitchen table reading that text? If this story stayed with you, I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments. And thank you, truly, for listening.